In the heart of industrial Detroit, where smoke once darkened the sky and the rhythm of machinery shook the earth, there stood a monument to American manufacturing power. Dodge main plant stretched across 5 million square feet of concrete, steel, and ambition. At its peak, 35,000 workers passed through its gates each day, their hands building the cars that would carry families across a growing nation. The factory's assembly lines moved with mechanical precision, producing vehicles that bore the proud Dodge name, a name that once meant quality, innovation, and the fulfillment of the American dream. But dreams built on industrial might can crumble with shocking speed. Today, if you travel to Hamtramck, Michigan, and search for the legendary Dodge main plant, you will find nothing. Not ruins draped in ivy, not skeletal frames standing as monuments to a lost age, not even a commemorative plaque marking where history once lived. The entire complex, every brick, every beam, every trace of the factory that once employed a small city's worth of workers has vanished. In 1980, bulldozers tore through the sprawling plant with ruthless efficiency, erasing in mere months what had taken decades to build. It was not abandoned to decay like so many other American factories. It was not repurposed into lofts or museums. It was demolished completely, as if the powers that controlled its fate wanted to ensure that no ghost of its former glory could haunt the landscape. This erasure was the final chapter in a story marked by tragedy from its very beginning. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who built this empire with their own hands, would both die under mysterious circumstances, just as their success reached its zenith. The factory they created became a battleground for labor rights, where blood was shed and lives were lost in violent clashes between workers desperate for dignity and corporations determined to maintain control. For decades, men worked in conditions so brutal that injury and death were simply accepted as the cost of employment. Racism was institutionalized, with black workers confined to the most dangerous jobs and denied the opportunities given to their white counterparts. And when the end came, it came swiftly and without mercy, leaving thousands unemployed and an entire community devastated. More than 4,000 residents would be forced from their homes, their neighborhood demolished to make way for a modern plant that would employ only a fraction of the workers the old factory once did. The rise of two brothers and the birth of an empire begins in the late 1800s, when Detroit was still finding its identity. The city had not yet become the Motor City. Automobiles were curious novelties built by tinkerers in small shops, expensive toys for the wealthy rather than practical transportation for the masses. John Francis Dodge, born in 1864, and his younger brother, Horace Elgin Dodge, born in 1868, grew up in Niles, Michigan, in a working-class family that understood the value of skilled labor. Their father ran a small machine shop, and both boys learned early how to work with metal, tools, and precision equipment. They were not dreamers who sketched impossible inventions in notebooks. They were craftsmen who understood how things fit together, how parts could be made better, and how quality work could earn a reputation that no advertising could buy. By the 1890s, the brothers had moved to Detroit and opened their own machine shop. They started small, taking on contract work, building parts for other companies, and earning a reputation for excellent craftsmanship. They made bicycle parts during the bicycle craze that swept America. They made stove parts, engine components, anything that required precision metalwork and attention to detail. The work was steady but unremarkable, the kind of honest labor that built modest fortunes but rarely changed the world. But in 1900, opportunity arrived in the form of a man named Ransom Olds, who was trying to build a simple, affordable automobile he called the Oldsmobile. Olds needed engines, and the Dodge brothers delivered. Their engines were reliable, well-made, and exactly what the young automobile industry needed. Soon orders poured in faster than they could fill them, and the brothers found themselves at the center of a revolution they had not anticipated. Then came the meeting that would change everything. In 1903, a man named Henry Ford approached the Dodge brothers with a proposal. Ford had big ideas about building cars for the masses, but he lacked the capital and manufacturing capacity to make his vision real. He needed partners who could supply parts and help finance his venture. The Dodge brothers agreed to invest $10,000, a fortune for them at the time, and in return, They would manufacture engines, transmissions, and axles for Ford's new automobile company. It was a gamble, but it was one that would pay off beyond their wildest expectations. The partnership proved extraordinarily successful. Ford's Model T became the most popular car in America, and the Dodge brothers supplied the critical components that made it run. Money poured in, more money than the brothers had ever imagined possible. By 1913, the brothers had become wealthy men, millionaires several times over, but they also began to feel constrained. They were building parts for someone else's vision, working to someone else's specifications, and watching as Henry Ford took all the glory while they remained in the shadows as mere suppliers. The Dodge brothers wanted more. They wanted to build complete automobiles under their own name. They wanted to control their own destiny. They wanted the world to know that the Dodge name meant something. In 1914, they made their move. They announced they would stop supplying parts to Ford and instead build their own car. Henry Ford was furious, viewing their decision as a betrayal of the partnership that had made them all rich. He tried to withhold dividend payments to punish the brothers for their defiance, leading to a bitter legal battle that dragged through the courts and exposed the ruthless side of the automotive industry. The Dodge brothers ultimately won, securing a court-ordered payout from Ford that gave them the capital they needed to pursue their dream. With their newfound independence and millions of dollars in hand, they set out to build not just a car, but a factory that would dwarf anything Detroit had seen before. The construction of Dodge Main began in 1910, but it was the expansion in the mid-1910s that transformed it into something monumental. The brothers purchased land in Hamtramck, a small Polish enclave surrounded by Detroit, a working-class community where land was cheaper and workers were plentiful. They began building what would become one of the largest manufacturing complexes in the world. The scale was staggering, almost incomprehensible to people who had never seen industrial production on such a massive level. The main factory building alone covered acres, a vast expanse of steel and glass that seemed to go on forever. Steel frameworks rose like the bones of some massive creature, girders crisscrossing against the sky. Glass windows, thousands upon thousands of them, were installed to let in natural light for the workers inside, a design feature that was both practical and beautiful. Smokestacks climbed into the sky, ready to exhale the smoke of industry day and night. Rail lines were laid directly into the factory so that raw materials could be delivered and finished cars could be shipped out without ever touching a public road, creating a self-contained world of production. Inside, the Dodge brothers designed a facility that could handle every stage of automobile production under one enormous roof. There were foundries where molten metal was poured into molds, the heat so intense that workers could barely stand to be near the furnaces for more than a few minutes at a time. There were machine shops where engines were assembled with exacting precision, each part fitted perfectly to ensure reliability and performance. There were stamping plants where sheets of steel were shaped into car bodies, massive presses coming down with enough force to bend metal like paper. There were paint booths where vehicles received their glossy finishes, the smell of chemicals hanging thick in the air. There were upholstery departments where skilled workers stitched leather and fabric, and final assembly lines where all the pieces came together into a finished product. Everything was designed for efficiency, for volume, for the relentless production that modern manufacturing demanded. The factory was a marvel of organization, a carefully choreographed dance of labor and machinery that transformed raw materials into finished automobiles at a pace that seemed almost magical. When the first Dodge automobile rolled off the line in November 1914, it was a moment of triumph. The car was well built, reliable, and reasonably priced, exactly what the American market wanted. Demand exploded almost immediately. Within a year, the Dodge brothers were producing tens of thousands of vehicles annually, and orders continued to pour in faster than they could fill them. Dodge Main became the beating heart of their operation, a factory that never slept, where shifts ran around the clock and the sound of hammers, presses, and engines never ceased. The brothers had achieved what they set out to do. They had created an empire of their own making, one that bore their name and reflected their vision of quality and craftsmanship. But success came with a price that would soon become tragically clear. The Dodge brothers had built an empire, but they would not live long enough to see it reach its full potential. In January 1920, both brothers attended the New York Automobile Show, a yearly event where manufacturers displayed their latest models and competed for attention from dealers and the press. The show was a success for Dodge, with crowds admiring their vehicles and orders flowing in. But something went wrong during the trip. Both John and Horace became ill with what was initially thought to be a simple case of the flu. Influenza was still a feared disease in 1920, just 2 years after the devastating Spanish flu pandemic had killed millions worldwide, sweeping through cities and towns with terrifying speed. But the Dodge brothers were strong, successful men at the height of their power, wealthy enough to afford the best medical care available. No one imagined the illness would be serious. John Dodge's condition worsened rapidly. Pneumonia set in, a common and often deadly complication of influenza, filling his lungs with fluid and making it impossible for him to breathe properly. Despite the efforts of doctors, his body could not fight off the infection. On January 14, 1920, John Francis Dodge died in New York at the age of 55. The news shocked the automotive world and sent ripples through Detroit's business community. One of the industry's most successful pioneers was gone, struck down seemingly without warning, his death coming at the very moment when his company was thriving. Horace Dodge, devastated by the loss of his brother and business partner, returned to Detroit to bury John and take over the company they had built together. The funeral was a massive affair, with thousands of mourners lining the streets to pay their respects to a man who had helped build Detroit into an industrial powerhouse. But Horace's health was also deteriorating. He had contracted the same illness, and despite the best medical care money could buy, he never fully recovered. His body weakened day by day. His energy faded. The grief of losing his brother seemed to accelerate his decline, as if the emotional toll was too much for his immune system to handle. Just 10 months after John's death, on December 10, 1920, Horace Elgin Dodge also died. He was 52 years old. In less than a year, the two men who had built Dodge from a small machine shop into one of the most successful automobile companies in America were both dead. The deaths were officially attributed to pneumonia, following influenza, a diagnosis that made sense on the surface. But rumors began to circulate almost immediately, whispers in back rooms and speculative conversations in Detroit's social circles. Some whispered that the brothers had been poisoned by business rivals who wanted to take over their empire. Others suggested that the stress of running such a massive operation, the constant pressure of competition and expansion, had weakened their bodies beyond recovery. A few speculated that they had been working with dangerous chemicals in their factories for years, lead, mercury, solvents, and that long-term exposure had finally taken its toll, weakening their immune systems and making them vulnerable to disease. No evidence ever emerged to support these theories, and doctors insisted the deaths were simply the result of a virulent flu strain. But the coincidence of both brothers dying within months of each other, both from the same illness contracted at the same event, left many people wondering if there was more to the story than simple bad luck. The mystery has never been fully resolved, and to this day, the deaths of the Dodge brothers remain one of the automotive industry's most haunting what-ifs. The deaths left the Dodge company in the hands of their widows, who had no experience running a massive industrial operation. The brothers had been the driving force behind every decision, every innovation, every expansion. Without them, the company drifted, still profitable, but lacking the vision and leadership that had made it great. In 1925, unable to manage the complexities of the business, the family sold the company to a banking group for $146 million, one of the largest financial transactions of the era and a sum that shocked Wall Street with its magnitude. 3 years later, in 1928, the Chrysler Corporation purchased Dodge, and Dodge, Maine became part of the Chrysler Empire, just another factory in a growing conglomerate rather than the crown jewel of an independent company built by two brothers with a dream. But the factory's troubles were only beginning. Inside the walls of Dodge, Maine, life was hard, dangerous, and often short. The conditions that workers endured in the 1920s, 1930s, and beyond were brutal by any measure. The kind of conditions that would be illegal today but were simply accepted as the reality of industrial labor in an era before worker protections. The factory floor was a place of constant noise, a deafening roar that made conversation impossible and left men's ears ringing for hours after their shifts ended. It was a place of oppressive heat, especially in summer when temperatures inside the plant could reach well over 100 degrees. The combination of machinery, furnaces, and lack of ventilation turning the factory into an oven. And it was a place of unrelenting pressure, where supervisors watched every move and the pace of work never slowed. Men worked long shifts, often 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, with only brief breaks for meals. If you couldn't keep up with the pace, if your body gave out or your mind wandered for even a moment, you were replaced. There was always someone else, waiting outside the factory gates, desperate for work, willing to accept any conditions just to feed their family. The machinery was unforgiving, designed for efficiency rather than safety. Massive presses stamped out car parts with enough force to crush bone, and there were no guards, no safety features, nothing to protect a worker who made a mistake or moved too slowly. Conveyor belts moved constantly, pulling workers along with them, demanding that hands move faster and faster to keep up with the mechanical rhythm. Molten metal was poured in the foundries, where temperatures soared to levels that made the skin blister and the air shimmer with heat. The fumes were toxic, a mixture of chemicals and burned materials that hung in the air and made breathing difficult. Men lost fingers in the presses, the machines continuing their relentless work as blood pooled on the factory floor. They lost hands in the machinery, entire limbs torn away in moments of inattention. They lost their lives in explosions, fires, and accidents that were so common they barely made the newspapers, unless the death toll was particularly high. The company kept no official records of workplace injuries and deaths, or if they did, those records have long since disappeared, but workers estimated that someone was seriously injured or killed almost every week. There were no safety regulations worth mentioning, no government oversight, no requirements for protective equipment, hard hats, safety goggles, protective gloves. These were luxuries that cost money, and the company saw no reason to provide them when workers could be replaced so easily. If a man got hurt, another man was waiting outside the gates to take his place within minutes. Jobs were scarce, especially during the Great Depression, when unemployment reached 25% and families went hungry, and workers knew they had no power to demand better conditions. You worked under whatever conditions the company set, or you didn't work at all. The air inside Dodge Main was thick with dust, smokes, and chemical vapors that made eyes water and throats burn. Men breathed it in for years, their lungs slowly filling with particles of metal, asbestos, and industrial chemicals that would eventually kill them. Asbestosis, silicosis, and other industrial diseases were rampant, though they were rarely diagnosed or acknowledged by company doctors who were paid to minimize compensation claims. Workers simply got sick, grew weaker, and died, often in their 50s or 60s, their bodies worn out by decades of hard labor in poisonous conditions. Their widows received nothing, no compensation, no pension, just poverty, and the knowledge that their husbands had given their lives to a company that cared nothing for them. The speed of the assembly line was a particular torture, a relentless mechanical pace that treated human beings like components in a machine. The line never stopped during a shift, never slowed down, never gave workers a moment to rest or catch their breath. If you needed to use the bathroom, you had to hold it or risk being written up for leaving your station. If you made a mistake, if a part didn't fit quite right, or you couldn't keep up with the speed of the line, the supervisor was there immediately, shouting, threatening termination, sometimes physically pushing workers to move faster. The pressure was relentless, and men cracked under it. Some broke down physically, their bodies giving out from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes becoming common among workers in their 40s and 50s. Others broke mentally, unable to cope with the dehumanizing monotony of the work. The same repetitive motions hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Depression was widespread, but never acknowledged, and more than a few workers took their own lives, unable to bear the burden of working in conditions that stripped away their humanity. And then there was the violence. In the 1930s, as the Great Depression devastated the American economy, and unemployment soared to levels never seen before or since, workers across the country began to organize. They formed unions, demanding better wages, safer conditions, and the right to be treated like human beings rather than interchangeable machine parts. In Detroit, the United Auto Workers Union was gaining strength, organizing workers at factories across the city, and building a movement that threatened to upend the power structure of the automotive industry. Dodge, Maine became one of the battlegrounds where the future of labor relations would be decided, a focal point of the struggle between workers who had nothing left to lose and corporations determined to maintain their control at any cost. The corporations fought back viciously, using every weapon at their disposal to crush the union movement before it could gain momentum. They hired private security forces, armed thugs who were paid to intimidate, beat, and even kill union organizers. These men patrolled the factory grounds, watching for any sign of union activity and dealing with troublemakers through violence rather than negotiation. They planted spies in the workforce, informants who pretended to be sympathetic to the union cause while reporting names back to management. They fired anyone suspected of union sympathies and blacklisted them so they could never work in the industry again, ensuring that not only the worker, but their entire family would suffer for their defiance. The message was clear: organize, and you will lose everything. In 1937, tensions reached a breaking point. On March 7th, a group of workers staged a sit-down strike inside Dodge, Maine, occupying the factory and refusing to leave until their demands for recognition and better conditions were met. The tactic was bold and unprecedented, transforming the factory itself into a battleground. Workers barricaded themselves inside, sleeping on the factory floor, and subsisting on food smuggled in by supporters. The company responded with force that shocked even hardened observers. Police were called in, along with private security guards armed with clubs, tear gas, and in some cases, firearms. What followed was a day of violence that left dozens of workers injured and the factory stained with blood that would take days to wash away. Workers were dragged out of the plant and beaten in the streets while crowds of supporters watched in horror. Tear gas filled the air, choking men and women who had gathered outside to support the strike, the gas burning eyes and lungs and sending people fleeing in panic. Gunshots rang out, though accounts differ on who fired first. Workers claimed the security forces opened fire without provocation, while the company insisted that workers had attacked first with makeshift weapons. Several workers were shot, and while no one died that day, a minor miracle given the intensity of the violence, the injuries were severe. Broken bones, concussions, lacerations, and chemical burns sent dozens of men to the hospital. The Battle of the Overpass, as it came to be known, sent a clear message. The company would not tolerate defiance, and they were willing to use deadly force to maintain control. But the workers did not give up. The violence only strengthened their resolve, turning fence-sitters into committed union members and bringing national attention to the struggle. Over the following years, through strikes, negotiations, legal battles, and continued violence, they slowly won concessions from the company. By the early 1940s, the United Auto Workers had secured contracts at Dodge, Maine, guaranteeing better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions, and the right to collective bargaining. It was a hard-won victory, paid for with blood and sacrifice, and it transformed the lives of thousands of workers who finally had some measure of protection and dignity in their workplace. Yet even as conditions improved for white workers, the factory remained a place of inequality and discrimination for black employees. Racism was not hidden or subtle. It was systematic, institutionalized, and defended by both the company and many white workers who saw black employees as competition for jobs, rather than fellow laborers deserving of equal respect. Black workers were systematically excluded from skilled positions and confined to the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs in the factory, the foundries where heat was most intense, the areas where toxic chemicals were handled, the positions where injury and death were most common. They were paid less than their white counterparts for the same work, often receiving as little as half the wages that white workers earned. Segregation was enforced both formally and informally, with separate break areas, separate bathrooms, and separate entrances to the factory. Black workers ate their lunches apart from white workers, used different water fountains, and were forbidden from entering certain parts of the plant. When black workers protested these conditions, when they dared to demand equal treatment and equal pay, they were fired without hesitation or faced worse consequences. Union leadership, dominated by white workers, often failed to support their black colleagues, viewing racial equality as a distraction from bread-and-butter economic issues. The racism was not hidden. It was open, accepted, and defended as the natural order of things. It would take decades of struggle, legal battles, and the civil rights movement of the 1960s before conditions began to improve. And even then, equality remained more of a promise than a reality, with Black workers continuing to face discrimination in hiring, promotion, and treatment well into the 1970s and beyond. Through World War II, Dodge Main found new purpose and a chance at redemption. The factory, like many American industrial facilities, was converted to wartime. Production transforming overnight from a manufacturer of consumer goods into a critical part of the war effort. Assembly lines that once built cars now built trucks, jeeps, and components for B-29 bombers, the massive aircraft that would eventually drop atomic bombs on Japan and end the war. The plant operated at full capacity, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, with workers putting in overtime to meet the military's insatiable demand for equipment. Thousands of workers, including many women who entered the industrial workforce for the first time, labored to support the war effort, their contributions helping to establish the United States as the arsenal of democracy that could outproduce any enemy. Dodge Main became a symbol of American industrial might, proof that the nation's factories could be mobilized for total war, and that American workers could rise to any challenge when the stakes were high enough. When the war ended in 1945, the factory returned to civilian production, and the post-war economic boom brought unprecedented prosperity to Detroit. Demand for automobiles soared as returning soldiers married, started families, and moved to the rapidly expanding suburbs that were transforming the American landscape. Dodge Main churned out cars by the millions, and for a time, the future seemed bright, limitless, filled with the promise that America's industrial dominance would last forever. Workers earned good wages, bought houses, sent their children to college, and believed that their sacrifices during the war years had earned them a permanent place in the middle class. Detroit itself became a symbol of American success, a city where factory workers could achieve a standard of living that previous generations could never have imagined. But the seeds of decline were already being sown, invisible to most, but growing steadily beneath the surface of prosperity. By the 1960s and 1970s, the American automobile industry faced challenges it had never encountered before and was ill-equipped to handle. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan, began to erode market share as companies like Toyota and Honda introduced smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles that appealed to a changing consumer base. Japanese cars were better built than their American counterparts, more reliable, more thoughtfully designed, and offered at competitive prices that American manufacturers struggled to match. The oil crises of the 1970s, when Middle Eastern nations restricted petroleum exports and gas prices skyrocketed, made gas-guzzling American vehicles suddenly seem obsolete and irresponsible. Consumers started looking elsewhere, and American automakers were slow to adapt to the new reality. At the same time, the factories themselves were aging into obsolescence. Dodge Main, built in the 1910s and expanded piecemeal over the decades as production demands grew, was now outdated in almost every respect. The layout was inefficient compared to modern plants designed with flow and logistics in mind. The machinery was old and required constant maintenance, breaking down frequently and costing the company money and lost production time. The building itself was literally falling apart, with leaking roofs that let in rain and snow, crumbling floors that pose safety hazards, and infrastructure, electrical systems, plumbing, ventilation, that had long outlived its intended lifespan. Renovation would have been expensive, but the fundamental problem was that the entire facility was built for a different era of manufacturing, one that no longer made economic sense in an age of automation and global competition. Chrysler, which owned Dodge, was in serious financial trouble. The company was losing money year after year, bleeding market share to foreign competitors, and facing the very real possibility of bankruptcy. Something had to be done, and quickly. In 1978, after months of internal debate and financial analysis, Chrysler announced that Dodge Main would be closed. After nearly 70 years of operation, the factory that had once symbolized American industrial dominance, that had employed generations of workers and produced millions of vehicles, would be shut down permanently. The announcement devastated the community. Hamtramck was a working-class city, and Dodge, Maine was its economic heart, the reason the city existed. Thousands of workers faced unemployment at a time when factory jobs were disappearing across the industrial Midwest. Local businesses that depended on the factory and its workers, restaurants, bars, shops, service providers, faced ruin as their customer base evaporated. Overnight, families who had worked at Dodge, Maine for generations, fathers passing jobs to sons, suddenly had no future. The social fabric of the community began to fray as people moved away in search of work, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned neighborhoods. On January 30th, 1980, Dodge, Maine produced its last vehicle. Workers gathered to watch the final car roll off the line, and many wept openly, knowing they were witnessing the end of an era. It was a Dodge St. Regis, an unremarkable sedan that would become a historical artifact simply by being the last. Cameras captured the moment, and newspapers ran stories about the closing, but the attention was fleeting. America was tired of hearing about factory closures, tired of Rust Belt decline, tired of the human cost of economic change. The country was moving on, and the workers of Dodge, Maine were being left behind. But the story didn't end with the closing. What happened next was, in many ways, even more tragic: a final insult that would compound the loss and ensure that Dodge, Maine would be not just closed, but erased from existence. Chrysler, with financial backing from the federal government and enthusiastic support from Detroit city officials desperate to save the auto industry, announced plans to build a new, modern assembly plant on the site where Dodge, Maine stood. The new plant would be smaller, more efficient, heavily automated, and designed for the realities of modern manufacturing in a global economy. But there was a problem. Dodge, Maine wasn't the only thing standing in the way of progress. The new plant required more land than Dodge, Maine had occupied, and much of that land was covered by a residential neighborhood known as Poletown, a historic Polish community that had existed for over a century, long before the automobile industry had even come to Detroit. Approximately 4,100 residents lived in Poletown, many of them elderly immigrants who had lived in the same houses for decades, who had raised their children there, buried their dead in local cemeteries, and worshipped in churches that their grandparents had helped build. The neighborhood included more than 1,000 homes, multiple churches including the historic Immaculate Conception Church, schools that had educated generations of children, and small businesses that had served the community for years. It was a complete community with deep roots, strong ties, and a sense of identity that went far beyond mere geography. Chrysler and the city declared that the new plant was essential to Detroit's economic survival. Jobs, tax revenue, and the future of the automobile industry were all at stake, they argued. The residents of Poletown would have to be displaced for the greater good. The neighborhood would have to be demolished to make way for progress. It was unfortunate, officials admitted, but necessary. The city invoked eminent domain, the legal power that allows government to seize private property for public use, and began the process of condemning homes and forcing residents to sell. The residents fought back with everything they had. They organized protests, holding vigils, and blocking bulldozers with their bodies. They filed lawsuits arguing that eminent domain was being abused, that seizing homes to benefit a private corporation was not a legitimate public use. They appealed to public sympathy, to the media, to anyone who would listen. Elderly women chained themselves to their front porches. Priests stood in front of bulldozers. Community members occupied the church, refusing to leave even as demolition crews waited outside. They argued passionately that their homes should not be sacrificed for corporate profit, that their community had value beyond its economic utility, that they had rights that should be protected. But their voices were drowned out by the economic arguments. Detroit was desperate, hemorrhaging jobs and population, facing the very real prospect of complete collapse. Chrysler needed the plant, and if they didn't get it, they threatened to build elsewhere, taking thousands of potential jobs with them. The city needed the tax revenue and the symbolic victory of keeping auto manufacturing within its borders. Suburban communities didn't want the displaced residents, and state officials sided with Detroit. The political and economic forces aligned against Poletown were overwhelming. In 1981, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in favor of the project in a controversial 5-3 decision that expanded the definition of public use to include economic development. Justice James Ryan, writing in dissent, warned that the decision would allow private corporations to use government power to seize land from ordinary citizens. But the majority opinion prevailed. The legal avenue exhausted, the demolitions began. Families were forced from their homes, many receiving compensation that was far below the market value of their property and nowhere near enough to buy comparable housing elsewhere. The elderly suffered most, uprooted from homes they had lived in for half a century, severed from communities that had been their entire world. Churches that had stood for generations, where weddings and funerals had marked the passages of countless lives, were torn down despite protests from clergy and parishioners. Schools were destroyed, their playgrounds where children had laughed now, reduced to rubble. Small businesses were bulldozed, the dreams of immigrant entrepreneurs erased along with their storefronts. Entire blocks were leveled in a matter of weeks. The Poletown neighborhood, like Dodge, Maine before it, was erased from the map as completely as if it had never existed. The new plant, eventually called Detroit Hamtramck Assembly, did bring jobs when it opened in 1985, but far fewer than Dodge, Maine had once provided. Modern manufacturing required fewer workers, relying on robotics and automation to do the work that human hands once performed. Where Dodge, Maine had employed 35,000 at its peak, the new plant would employ just a few thousand. The promises of economic revival never fully materialized. The jobs that were created paid less in real terms than the jobs that had been lost. The community that had been destroyed was never rebuilt. The displaced residents scattered across the region, their bonds broken, their shared history dissolved. And Detroit continued its long decline, the new plant unable to reverse decades of disinvestment and population loss. Today, the site where Dodge, Maine once stood is occupied by a modern assembly plant that produces electric vehicles for General Motors, the latest transformation in a location that has seen empires rise and fall. But the history is gone, deliberately erased. There are no markers acknowledging the tens of thousands of workers who built cars there for 70 years. There are no monuments to the Poletown residents who were displaced. There are no plaques explaining what once stood on this ground. The toxic contamination left behind by decades of industrial production has been partially cleaned up, though studies suggest that chemicals still remain in the soil, a permanent legacy of the manufacturing that once took place there. But the human stories, the struggles and sacrifices, the victories and defeats have been buried beneath new construction and forgotten by all but those who lived through them. The erasure of Dodge, Maine is unusual in the history of American industry. Many old factories become ruins that photographers visit to capture industrial decline, or are transformed into lofts and museums. But Dodge, Maine was given no such second life. It was demolished quickly and completely, as if those who controlled its fate wanted to ensure no trace of its history would survive. Some see this as pragmatic. Old factories are expensive to maintain, and repurposing them is often not economically viable. But others see something darker, an attempt to bury the inconvenient truths of industrial capitalism, to erase evidence of exploitation and inequality that define the factory's history. The story of Dodge, Maine is a microcosm of American industry itself. It rose from nothing, built by two brothers who believed in hard work and quality craftsmanship. It became a symbol of American manufacturing power, producing millions of vehicles and employing tens of thousands of workers. It endured strikes, violence, and economic turmoil. It adapted to wartime needs and post-war prosperity. But when economics changed and old business models became obsolete, it was discarded without sentiment. The workers who gave their lives to Dodge, Maine, literally in many cases, dying from industrial accidents or diseases caused by years of exposure to toxic workplace conditions, received little recognition for their sacrifices beyond a union pension, if they were fortunate enough to retire. The families displaced from Poletown were compensated according to legal formulas, but never made whole, never fully restored to what they had lost: homes, neighbors, churches, and community. The community that once thrived around the factory was permanently scattered like seeds in the wind, its bonds broken, its shared identity dissolved, its history forgotten by everyone, except those who had lived it. What remains today is a story, passed down through memories that grow dimmer each year, and old photographs that show a world that seems impossibly distant. It survives in Union archives where researchers can find documents and testimonies about working conditions and labor struggles. It lives in newspaper clippings that captured moments of triumph and tragedy, strikes and celebrations, openings and closings. It persists in the fading recollections of elderly workers who remember what it was like to walk through those gates each morning, to punch the time clock, to take their place on the line, never knowing if they would walk back out at the end of the day. It is a story of ambition and tragedy, of progress and loss, of exploitation and resistance, of a time when America believed that industrial might could solve any problem and that growth would never end. But growth did end. The factories closed, the jobs disappeared, communities collapsed, and Dodge, Maine, once the largest automobile factory in the world, a complex so vast it had its own zip code and employed more workers than some cities had. Residence was reduced to nothing but memory and ghost stories told by old men in bars. In the end, Dodge, Maine is not a story of what was built. It is a story of what was destroyed, and sometimes what is destroyed says more about who we are than what we build.